Um, there's been a big push. I know there's an increasing amount of grant money that's been coming out of New York City, New York State. There had been a lot of money coming out of the federal government to fund those kinds of programs. And those programs are fantastic for two reasons. One is the success rate is astronomical. Kids who have therapists come into their homes when there's behavioral issues, when there's family dynamics that don't work, they are so much more likely to stay in school, to have behavior that doesn't end them up, in a prison or jail someday, than kids who are put into traditional foster care. So when it's possible, that's what we should be doing, because we know it works. So if for no other reason, because it's better for kids and the likelihood that they'll have a good, happy life where they can contribute to society, we should be doing it. The best reason to do it is that it costs a fraction of what it costs to send a kid to jail or to put them in a group home. If you want to place a family therapist in a home where they're visiting a family 3 or 4 times a week for an entire year, you're talking about less than $10,000, right? If you incarcerate a child in New York State for a year, whether it's in prison or in a group home or a foster care residential facility, you're spending over $100,000 a kid. When you start looking at the numbers of children that end up in the system, you're talking about millions of dollars that the taxpayers could be putting into different investments, right? If we could be funding schools, we could be fixing roads, we could be paying teachers more money, we could do all kinds of things. We could lower taxes. And we could do all that and have more kids lead productive lives. Kids who will become taxpayers. Kids who will work jobs that support the community. And so I'm really optimistic that those kinds of programs can positively impact the problem. And I think there are a lot of great organizations that are working on this. New York Foundling, the Children's Village, Children's Aid Society, just a couple in New York City. And it's happening in other cities across the U.S. I wish it were happening faster. Like I said, I think there's reasons to be pessimistic. I think it's unclear what a Trump administration will do in this front. With the folks who have been put up as nominees for important cabinet positions, like Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, it's hard for me to see, given his track record, that there's going to be a lot of support for alternatives to incarceration. Given that Trump ran as the law and order president, that typically is code for more police officers, more correctional officers, and more people going to jail. So I'm nervous that the administration's kind of like large, sweeping executive influence will mean that at a federal level, funding won't be there for alternatives to incarceration. I'm also nervous that it will, the kind of tone that's being set at the top will then kind of trickle down into certain programs. And I think there are places like New York City where Mayor de Blasio has very clearly said, like, New York is going to be a place that isn't going to change the way we do things, the things that we know that work, just because Donald Trump is a president. And I hope that that's true. But even if it is, New York City is one city in a very big country, right? If there's 11 million people here, there's 309 million or so in other places in the country. So I'm concerned about what the Trump administration will mean for those kinds of reforms. And more broadly, I wonder for adults, of whom there's over 2 million incarcerated in the U.S. right now, I wonder if there's any real commitment to creating meaningful reforms. I think it's easier to talk about keeping kids out of prison, stopping kids from being incarcerated when they shouldn't have been. But we have as a society, we have a very kind of like puritanical view of ourselves, right? Like right and wrong. And when someone does something wrong, we forget about them. We lock them up, we throw them in a jail somewhere. We just kind of pretend that they're not there because they're invisible to us. So I'm pessimistic that there's going to be the kind of movement that would be needed to overcome the power of correctional unions, law enforcement unions, and the private prison system, which has a super high financial stake in the game. And what I'm worried about is that there won't be the kind of will for people to push through how difficult those barriers would be to overcome. there's going to be a lot of things, I think, in the next 4 years that people are going to have to organize around in order to prevent or to keep on a good track. It's hard for me to imagine that helping people who we think of as criminals or felons, helping them have better lives, it's hard for me to think that's ever going to be on the top of anybody's list. Yeah, so one of the joys of my job when I was at the Children's Village was I got to run a mentoring program. And so my job was to help get adults in the community connected with kids, just to be somebody in their lives who cared about them. Because like I said, we feel really strongly that if you're connected to somebody who cares about you, wants you to be successful, you're much more likely to make good decisions, good choices. And through that program, we get to see a lot of kind of individual kids build relationships that would last for a long time. Kids who would meet a mentor at 14, and 10 years later, they'd still be friends. They'd still have lunch once a week or whatever. The other part of my job was I was in charge of finding success stories to talk about the work the agency did, to say, like, look, this works. It's worth the grant money. It's worth the donations that people make, because the work that the social workers and therapists do really affects kids' lives. So we'd see a lot of young people who would come through the system and find the right resources to be successful. We had one kid who entered foster care at 5 years old. His father wasn't around pretty much since he was born, and at 5, his mother said she couldn't take care of him anymore, and he went to 12 foster homes before he was 15. At 15, he broke into a store, stole a lot of things, and went to jail. Was incarcerated for 2 years and ended up in residential foster care to try to graduate high school. He didn't graduate high school until he was 21. But when he graduated, after all that time and finally deciding he wanted something out of his life, he was the valedictorian of his class, which is great. He was older than the other kids, but he made some kind of remarkable changes. From there, he went on to Vassar, graduated with a bachelor's degree from Vassar, and then when I last talked to him 3 years ago, he was in a master's program to become a social worker. That kind of story is rare. When you lose your family at 5 years old, and then you go through family after family, more than a dozen families who can't care for you or who choose not to care for you, the message as a young person is, I'm not valuable. No one cares about me. I'm not worth people's time, their emotions, their love, their care. And it's really hard to find reasons to continue to work at being successful when you think no one cares about you, when you think you're not worth being cared about. It was remarkable that he was able to go to such a great school, go on to graduate school, and then make the choice to want to help kids like him, rather than saying, I made it out of this system that no one ever makes it out of. I'm going to go get a degree in finance. I'm going to go make as much money as I can. I don't think anyone would have begrudged him that decision, but he recognized how important it is for young people to have support, and I think that's probably the best success story. There are lots of kids who find ways to go out, get out of the system, go to college, get a nice job, start a family, and I think those are fantastic, and that's really should be the goal of the criminal justice system that involves children and kids. But I think when someone who comes through the system has such a hard time and then chooses to go back and try to make it better, try to help other kids, I think that's about as amazing as it gets.